March 12th, 2007, Cedar Ridge, Missouri was the kind of place where the most exciting thing to happen was a new family moving in. That illusion shattered the moment the call came through to dispatch. Possible child endangerment, 344 Willow Lane, anonymous caller. I was in the precinct when I heard it, finishing up a minor case. Calls like these weren't rare, but something about the dispatcher's tone made me pause. 30 minutes later, I was standing outside a house that radiated unease. It stood out like a sore thumb. Among the tidy lawns and neatly painted homes, this one looked abandoned. The paint was peeling in long strips, the windows were covered with thick, dirt-streaked curtains, and a sagging swing set sat in the yard, its chains rusted and broken. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice strained. "Ma'am, we received a report about a child welfare concern at this address," I replied calmly. Her eyes widened slightly before narrowing again. "There's no kids here," she said, a little too quickly. "Mind if I take a look around?" I asked, taking a step forward. She stiffened, blocking the door. "You need a warrant for that." Before I could respond, a sound caught my ear. A faint, muffled whimper. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. I froze, listening intently. The woman noticed and moved to shut the door, but I stopped her with my foot. "Ma'am, I need to come in," I said firmly. She tried to protest, but I was already calling for backup. While we waited, I kept her talking, her excuses growing increasingly frantic. When the other officers arrived, we entered the house. The smell hit me first, a sour mix of garbage, mildew, and something worse I couldn't place. The living room was a disaster zone. Empty beer cans and fast food wrappers were strewn across the floor, and a sagging couch sat under a flickering, outdated TV. The walls were stained yellow from cigarette smoke, with holes punched into them in several places. Then, I noticed the hallway. At the end was a door with multiple padlocks, the metal scratched and tarnished from years of use. "What's behind there?" I asked. "Storage," she muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Open it." She hesitated, but when I pressed further, she fumbled for a set of keys, her hands trembling. When the last padlock was undone, the door creaked open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The air was damp and cold, filled with the metallic scent of mildew. A single dim bulb cast weak light over the concrete walls. In the corner of the room sat a small figure, hunched on a torn mattress. He was a boy, no older than 7, wearing clothes that hung off his skeletal frame. His skin was pale, and his wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine. I knelt down, my voice shaking. "Hey there, buddy. You're safe now." He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared. I called for paramedics as one of the officers wrapped the boy in a blanket. When he carried him out, I looked back at the woman standing in the doorway. Her face was blank, devoid of emotion, as though she was incapable of feeling anything at all. This was only the beginning, and even then, I knew it was the worst case I'd ever seen. The case quickly escalated once we had Ethan, yes, that's what we later learned his name was, in the care of emergency responders. His silence, the haunted look in his eyes, and the countless scars on his frail body spoke volumes. But this story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next day, I sat down with our lead detective and a child services representative to map out the investigation. Ethan remained in the hospital, still unable to speak, while doctors cataloged his injuries. Broken ribs, malnutrition, scars from what looked like burns. It was clear this abuse had been ongoing for years. Back at the precinct, I started with the neighbors. Someone had made that anonymous call, and I was determined to find out who. Mrs. Carol Emerson lived next door to 314 Willow Lane. She was a retired teacher, her yard impeccably maintained, with flower beds blooming even in the early spring chill. But as I stood on her porch, her expression was guarded. "I told your officers everything I know," she said, folding her arms. "Ma'am, anything you can tell me could help this child," I replied, keeping my tone calm but firm. "Ethan deserves that much." Her posture softened at the mention of his name. She stepped back and gestured for me to come inside. Carol sat across from me, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "I've lived here for 15 years, she began. "That family moved in about 3 years ago. I don't even know their names. They kept to themselves." "What made you suspicious?" I asked. "At first, it was little things. Yelling late at night, windows always shut tight, even in the summer. Then I started hearing noises, muffled crying like someone was trying to keep quiet. She paused, her face pale. I called child services a year ago. They came out, but nothing happened. Nothing at all? They left after 10 minutes, said they couldn't get in. I thought about calling again, but I didn't want to cause trouble. I didn't think it was this bad. Her guilt was palpable, and I couldn't blame her. Too many times, these situations fall through the cracks. But this wasn't just a failure of the system. It was something far darker. That evening, I dug deeper into the family's background. What I found sent a chill down my spine. The parents, Mark and Lisa Hendricks, had a history with Child Protective Services in another state. Reports of neglect and abuse dated back years, but they had always managed to move or dodge charges. They'd been living in Cedar Ridge for 3 years, completely under the radar. The most recent report, the one Carol had mentioned, revealed even more disturbing details. A social worker noted signs of neglect but didn't push further, citing lack of access to the home. It was a damning reminder of how easily the system could fail. The next day, we secured a warrant and returned to 314 Willow Lane, this time with the legal clearance to search every inch of the property. The full scope of the horror became clear. Upstairs, behind a locked closet door, we found a small, makeshift storage space filled with disturbing items. A notebook with scrawled punishments, a collection of belts and wires stained with what appeared to be blood, and photographs of Ethan in various states of distress. Mark and Lisa Hendricks were brought in for questioning that evening. Mark was belligerent, denying everything with a sneer. Lisa, however, broke under pressure, her voice trembling as she admitted they had kept Ethan locked away to protect him from himself. Protect him from what? I asked, my voice colder than I intended. He's always been difficult, she whispered. You don't understand. He wouldn't listen. He needed discipline. Her words were void of remorse, and my hands clenched into fists under the table. Discipline, I repeated. This wasn't discipline, this was torture. By the end of the week, we had enough evidence to charge both parents with felony child abuse, neglect, and false imprisonment. But even as the case moved forward, questions lingered. How had they been able to evade scrutiny for so long? How many others had failed Ethan before we found him? Those questions kept me awake at night. But one thing was clear. The system wasn't just broken, it was complicit. The day we raided 314 Willow Lane with a full warrant was one I'll never forget. It was a cold, overcast morning, the kind where the sky presses down on you and everything feels heavier. The Hendrickses were already in custody, but the search would reveal the true depth of their depravity. The first place we revisited was the basement. It was worse than it had initially appeared. The air was damp, and the faint smell of rot clung to every surface. There were no windows, only a single dim light bulb dangling from the ceiling. The walls were lined with crude tally marks, Ethan's way of tracking days, months, maybe even years of his captivity. The mattress Ethan had been found on was a disaster of torn fabric and stains, its springs poking through like jagged teeth. Next to it was an overturned plastic crate filled with crumbs and spoiled food, the smell of decay lingering in the air. A small metal bucket stood in one corner, its purpose too obvious to ignore. As I stood there, a wave of nausea hit me. It wasn't just the stench. It was the realization of how long this boy had been forced to survive like this. Alone, forgotten. In the cramped storage room upstairs, we found the notebook again. This time, we read through its contents more carefully. Each page listed infractions alongside chilling punishments. Spoke without permission. 24 hours no food. Tried to leave basement. 2 hours in the dark with no light. Cried too loudly. Hit with the belt. 5 times. Each punishment was meticulously recorded. The handwriting eerily neat. It was hard to believe that someone could inflict this kind of cruelty and then calmly document it like a grocery list. The hidden closet yielded more disturbing discoveries. A box of items lay at the back, partially buried under old newspapers. Inside, were small trinkets, a broken toy car, a ripped comic book, a single crayon. They were Ethan's, no doubt confiscated to deprive him of any comfort. I picked up the toy car, its wheels missing and paint chipped. It felt like holding a piece of Ethan's stolen childhood. On the cell phone, I'd buried it in the yard. Later that afternoon, I visited the hospital where Ethan was being treated. The attending physician handed me his file, her face grim. "Physically, he's stable," she said. "But the psychological damage—" She trailed off. The report detailed everything. Severe malnutrition. Ethan weighed just 38 pounds at 7 years old. Multiple healed fractures, ribs, arm, collarbone, all untreated. Scars consistent with burns likely inflicted with a cigarette or lighter, and then there were the emotional scars. Ethan hadn't spoken a single word since his rescue. He flinched at sudden movements and refused to eat unless someone stayed with him the entire time. "We're recommending long-term therapy," the doctor added. "He's been through more than most of us could imagine." The following evening, while reviewing the case files, I received an urgent call from the hospital. Ethan had spoken his first words. When I arrived, a social worker filled me in. "He was drawing," she said. "A dog, I think." He said, "Buddy." "Buddy?" I asked, confused. Apparently it was a dog he had when he was younger, before everything happened. Hearing that broke something in me. For the first time in years, Ethan had connected to a memory that brought him comfort. It was a small breakthrough, but it felt monumental. As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about all the ways this could have been prevented. Reports had been filed before, by neighbors, by a teacher at Ethan's old school, even by a concerned mail carrier. But every time, the system had failed him. This case wasn't just about the horrors inflicted by Mark and Lisa Hendricks. It was about a society that allowed Ethan to fall through the cracks again and again. The next step was building an airtight case against the Hendrickses. We needed more than the physical evidence. We needed witnesses, experts, anyone who could paint the full picture of what Ethan had endured. But as I sat at my desk that night, staring at photos of the basement and reading through the notebook's entries again, I realized something. This wasn't just about justice for Ethan. It was about ensuring no other child would ever endure what he had. The road ahead was long, and the darkness of this case would linger for years. But for Ethan, there was finally a glimmer of light. The fight for Ethan's justice began the moment the Hendrickses were arrested, but the battle was far from straightforward. Cases like this were as much about resilience as they were about evidence. We had mountains of the latter, but that didn't make the process any less grueling. It was a cloudy morning when the first court hearing took place. The room was packed, with reporters crammed into the back rows and a handful of concerned citizens filling the seats. Mark and Lisa Hendricks sat at the defense table, their expressions devoid of remorse. Mark, in particular, glared defiantly at anyone who dared to look his way. Ethan wasn't in attendance. He was still too fragile, emotionally and physically, to face his abusers. But his presence was felt in every piece of evidence presented. The photographs of the basement, the medical reports, the notebook of punishments, all painted a damning picture of the horrors he had endured. The defense tried their best to argue for leniency. They claimed the Hendrickses were overwhelmed, struggling financially, and lacked the tools to properly care for a child. It was a pitiful excuse, one that barely veiled their outright cruelty. The prosecution called several witnesses to the stand. First was Carol Emerson, the neighbor who had heard Ethan's muffled cries. She broke down during her testimony, her voice shaking as she described the night she made the anonymous call. "I thought I was doing enough by calling," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I should have done more. I'll never forgive myself for that." Next was Ethan's pediatrician, who detailed the extent of his injuries. He carefully explained the malnutrition, untreated fractures, and the psychological toll of prolonged abuse. His testimony was clinical but devastating, leaving many in the courtroom visibly shaken. Finally, we heard from a social worker who had visited the home a year prior. She admitted to being unable to gain access and cited the department's chronic understaffing as a reason the case was closed prematurely. It was a sobering reminder of how systemic failures compounded Ethan's suffering. As the trial unfolded, I checked in with Ethan regularly. He was now living with a foster family, carefully chosen by Child Services. It wasn't perfect. Ethan was still withdrawn, his trust in adults shattered, but he was slowly beginning to heal. One day, when I visited him at the hospital for a routine check-in, he surprised me. He handed me a drawing he'd made, a small stick figure holding hands with a taller one. "That's you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the first time I'd seen him smile. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson read the decision: Mark Hendricks guilty on all counts, Lisa Hendricks guilty on all counts. The judge wasted no time in issuing the sentence: life imprisonment for Mark and 25 years for Lisa, with no possibility of parole. Their expressions remained cold and emotionless as they were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. For Ethan, justice had been served, but the scars of what he endured would take much longer to heal. In the aftermath of the trial, the media latched onto the story, focusing not just on the Hendricks' crimes, but on the systemic failures that allowed them to persist for so long. Questions were asked at every level. Why had previous reports been ignored? Why was the social services department so underfunded? How many other children were suffering in silence just like Ethan had? Legislators promised reform, pledging increased funding for child welfare agencies and stricter protocols for investigating abuse allegations. Whether those promises were translated into action remained to be seen. As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. He was safe now, yes, but the road ahead would be difficult. Would he ever trust adults again? Would he ever be able to live without fear? But then I thought of his small smile and the drawing he'd given me. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes that's all you need to rebuild a life. A year after Ethan's rescue, I returned to Cedar Ridge. Not as an investigator, but as a visitor. The Hendricks case was officially closed, and Ethan had been adopted by a loving family in the neighboring town of Maplewood. As I drove down familiar streets, I reflected on the journey, a grim reminder of the darkness humanity is capable of, but also a testament to resilience and hope. Ethan's new family, the Johnsons, had opened their home and hearts to him. They were a couple in their early 40s with 2 older children who were thrilled to have a new sibling. When I arrived at their modest ranch-style home, Ethan was outside, playing with their golden retriever, Max. As I approached, he spotted me and hesitated for a moment before breaking into a grin, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. It was a far cry from the hollow, fearful child I'd first met in that basement. "Hi, Ethan," I said, crouching down to his level. "How's Max treating you?" "He's my best friend," Ethan replied confidently, tossing the ball for the dog to chase. His voice was stronger now, no longer a whisper. It was a small miracle, and I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride for how far he'd come. Inside, I sat with Ethan's adoptive parents, Sarah and Michael Johnson. They shared stories about Ethan's progress. "The first few months were hard," Sarah admitted, her eyes glistening. "He had nightmares almost every night, but little by little he started opening up. Therapy's been a lifesaver." Michael nodded. "He's still working through a lot, but he's got a spark now. He loves drawing and reading." "And Max? Max has been his rock." Hearing that warmed my heart. After everything Ethan had endured, he finally had a chance to be a kid. Before I left, Ethan wanted to show me something. He ran to his room and returned with a stack of drawings. One caught my eye immediately. It was a picture of a tall figure standing protectively beside a smaller one with a dog at their feet. "That's you, me, and Max," Ethan explained, looking proud. I swallowed hard, my emotions threatening to spill over. It's beautiful, Ethan. You're an amazing artist." The Hendricks case had sparked changes in Cedar Ridge and beyond. Reports of child abuse were now taken more seriously, with mandatory follow-ups for any concerns raised. Additional funding had been allocated to social services, allowing for better training and more resources. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a start. Ethan's story had become a rallying cry for reform, ensuring that his suffering wasn't in vain. As I left the Johnsons' house, I took one last look at Ethan, who was now sitting under a tree, sketching Max as the dog napped beside him. Driving away, I felt a mix of emotions. Relief that Ethan was safe, anger at how close he'd come to slipping through the cracks, and hope that he'd finally found a place to heal. This wasn't just Ethan's story. It was a story about the power of intervention, the importance of vigilance, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. True crime often leaves us with more questions than answers. Why do some people commit such heinous acts? Why do others turn a blind eye? But in Ethan's case, there was one answer I was sure of. Even in the darkest of nights, there's always a chance for light to break through. Ethan was proof of that, and though his scars would never fully fade, his story now carried a message of hope, a reminder that no child is ever truly forgotten, and no life is ever beyond saving.